The white envelope lay on the cold, unyielding surface of the metal desk, its embossed edges glinting under the sterile fluorescent light of General Lieutenant Rebecca Cole's quarters in Stuttgart. It was a thing of deceptive beauty, its creamy paper and elegant gold trim a stark contrast to the Spartan room around it. Her name was printed in bold, curling script, General Lieutenant Rebecca Cole. Not Becky, the name her family had once called her, a name now buried beneath years of silence and distance. She stared at it for nearly an hour, her breath shallow, her pulse a steady drumbeat in her ears. The envelope wasn't just paper, it was a summons, a challenge, a wound torn open with surgical precision. Rebecca's quarters were a study in discipline, a reflection of the life she'd carved out in the face of rejection. The steel bed was made with corners so sharp they could cut. The row of pressed uniforms hung like sentinels, and a locked trunk sat in the corner, its contents untouched by anyone but her. Outside, the wind howled across the base, rattling the flagpole with a metallic groan that seemed to echo her own unrest. The invitation had arrived that morning, slipped under her door like a traitor's note, and now it sat there, daring her to act. She traced the edges of the envelope with a callous fingertip, her mind racing back to a time when her name wasn't a rank, but a tether to a family that no longer claimed her. The invitation was from her sister, Hailey, announcing her marriage to Major Andrew Foster. The name hit like a grenade. Andrew. 6 years ago, in the dust-choked chaos of Helmand, Rebecca had crawled through a minefield to drag his bleeding body from a crater, his leg nearly severed, his eyes wide with the certainty of death. She'd saved him, her own shoulder torn by shrapnel, her mouth tasting of blood and ash. He'd whispered, "I'm in your debt," before the medevac whisked him away. Now he was marrying her sister. The irony was a blade, twisting deep. Her family hadn't spoken to her in years. No birthday cards, no calls when she nearly lost her hearing in her second deployment, no condolences when her father's coffin was lowered into the earth. Only silence, heavy and deliberate, like a wall built brick by brick. And now this, a pristine envelope, sealed with her mother Barbara's cursive scrawl. Behave. The word was a slap, a reminder of the expectations she'd shattered by choosing a life of steel over submission. Rebecca's fingers tightened around the envelope, as if she could crush the memories it summoned. Her mother's pursed lips, Hailey's sharp laughter, the way they turned her into a stranger in her own home. The base was unusually quiet that evening, the usual hum of drills and barked orders replaced by the wind's restless complaint. Rebecca stood, her boots silent on the concrete floor, and approached the narrow window overlooking the training field. Below, recruits moved through their paces, their shouts faint but fervent, their youth a stark contrast to the weight she carried. She envied their ignorance, their belief that loyalty and grit were enough to shield them from betrayal. The invitation felt like a live wire in her hand, crackling with unspoken accusations. She turned it over, noting the unbroken seal, the weight of its contents heavier than any order she'd ever received. A sharp knock broke her reverie. Sergeant Simmons entered without waiting, his broad frame filling the doorway. His eyes, sharp as radar, flicked to the envelope. "Heard about it," he said, his voice a low rumble, like gravel under tank treads. Simmons had been with her since she was a captain, back when she was still proving herself against a world that doubted women in command. He'd seen her at her most stubborn, her most broken, and never once flinched. "You going?" he asked, settling into a chair without invitation, his patience as unyielding as granite. Rebecca slid the invitation across the desk, the sound of paper on metal, like a blade being drawn. Simmons picked it up, his thick fingers careful, almost reverent. He scanned the gold lettering, exhaled through his nose and muttered, "Foster. The guy you pulled from that crater in Helmand." "Right." She nodded, her voice sharp and flat. "The same." The memory surged unbidden. The explosion, the dust cloud, Andrew's blood soaking the dirt, her own hands trembling as she disarmed the mine inches from his body. She'd carried that night like a scar, one she didn't display but never forgot. Simmons leaned back, the chair creaking under his weight. "You saved his life, and now he's marrying your sister. That's a hell of a plot twist." Silence settled between them, not awkward but familiar, like the hum of a well-worn rifle. It was the kind of quiet that held more meaning than words. the kind forged in shared battles and unspoken trust. Rebecca's gaze drifted back to the envelope, its presence a taunt. "You think I should go?" she asked finally, her voice softer than she intended, betraying a crack in her armor. Simmons studied her, his eyes narrowing as if reading a map only he could see. "Depends," he said. "You going to fight a war or bury a ghost?" The question landed like a mortar, precise and devastating. Rebecca laughed, a dry, scarred sound, not the kind that lifts weight, but the kind that acknowledges it. "Maybe I'll just watch someone burn," she said, her lips curling into a grim half-smile. Simmons didn't smile back. His expression was steady, unyielding, like the man himself. "Then go," he said. "But don't wear your stars like armor. Wear them like memory. Let them see who you became without them." His words lingered long after he left, sinking into her bones like the cold of the Stuttgart night. Rebecca placed the invitation back on the desk, its edges catching the light once more. She approached the window again, the recruits below now dispersing, their voices fading into the dark. The wind howled, the flagpole clanging in protest. Somewhere in the distance, a drill sergeant barked an order, and a recruit shouted back, "Sir, yes, sir." The blind enthusiasm of it stung, a reminder of the fire she'd once carried, now tempered by betrayal. Rebecca turned to her closet, her fingers brushing the dress uniform she hadn't worn since her father's funeral. A day when her family had refused her a seat in the front row, when her mother had whispered, "You shouldn't have come in uniform." She pulled it out, laying it across the bed, smoothing the sleeves as if they were old wounds. The stars on her shoulders gleamed, not with pride but with defiance. They thought shame would keep her away. They were wrong. She'd go, not to beg for acceptance, but to remind them of the woman they'd tried to erase. The envelope sat on the desk, a silent challenge. Rebecca met it with a soldier's resolve, her heart a battlefield, her stars a beacon in the dark. The Lufthansa flight from Stuttgart to Dallas sliced through the night sky, its engines a low hum that vibrated through General Lieutenant Rebecca Cole's bones. She sat by the window, the seat beside her deliberately empty, a small luxury she'd paid for to keep the world at bay. The sky outside was too soft, a velvety expanse of stars that seemed to mock the storm churning in her chest. Her dress uniform, carefully folded in the overhead compartment, was a silent passenger, its stars and ribbons a testament to battles fought and scars earned. She hadn't worn it since boarding, opting for a plain jacket, but its presence loomed, a reminder of the weight she carried. Rebecca's fingers brushed the edge of her water glass, condensation pooling beneath her touch. The stewardess, a young woman with a practiced smile, had noticed the ribbons pinned to her blouse during boarding, and offered champagne with a deferential nod. "For your service," she'd said, her voice warm. Rebecca had declined, asking for water instead, her tone clipped but polite. She didn't want fanfare, not tonight. Not when she was flying toward a battlefield more treacherous than any she'd faced in Helmand or Kandahar. This wasn't war, not in the way she knew it. No mines, no gunfire, just the quiet violence of family. She closed her eyes, not to sleep. She hadn't slept properly in days, but to mute the gravity of what awaited her. Over the Atlantic, the plane felt like a liminal space, a nowhere zone where she could briefly escape the pull of the past. But memories crept in unbidden, sharp as shrapnel. Her mother's voice, cold and final, at her father's funeral. "You shouldn't have come in uniform. It's disrespectful." Hailey's laughter, always too loud, too cutting. At family dinners where Rebecca's presence was tolerated but never welcomed. And Andrew Foster, his blood-soaked uniform under her hands, his whispered debt in the dust of Helmand. "I'm in your debt." Now he was marrying her sister, and the invitation, "Behave," sat in her carry-on like a live grenade. The plane dipped slightly, turbulence jostling her water glass. Rebecca opened her eyes, glancing at the empty seat beside her. She'd booked the red-eye flight deliberately, hoping for anonymity, for silence. No one from command knew she was going. Not even her driver had been told. She'd confirmed the ticket on her laptop in 30 seconds, the email's soft ping a quiet declaration of intent. She wasn't going to be welcomed, not really. She was going to be seen for the first time in years on her own terms. The memory of Helmand clawed its way forward. 6 years ago, the air had been thick with dust, the ground trembling with the aftershock of an IED. Andrew's leg was a mess of blood and bone, the mine beneath him a hair trigger from oblivion. Rebecca had crawled to him, her elbows grinding into gravel, her shoulder burning where shrapnel had bitten deep. She'd disarmed the mine with trembling fingers, her breath tasting of ash, her voice sharp and steady. "Don't move." He'd looked at her, eyes wide with terror and trust, and she'd pulled him free. The scar on her shoulder still ached in cold weather, a quiet reminder of a debt he'd never repaid. Now he was marrying Hailey, the sister who'd once called Rebecca a disgrace to the Cole name. The plane's intercom crackled, the captain announcing their descent into Dulles. Rebecca's heart thudded, not with fear but with a soldier's resolve, the kind that had carried her through fire and silence. The terminal, when she stepped into it, reeked of hand sanitizer and fresh wax, a sterile contrast to the chaos in her mind. Her military ID breezed her through customs, the officer's nod a small acknowledgement of her rank. She adjusted her bag, her boots clicking on the polished floor, and headed for the escalator. Before she reached it, her phone buzzed in her pocket, an unknown number flashing on the screen. Her thumb hovered over the decline button, anger flaring like a warning shot. But curiosity, that old betrayer, won out. "Hello," she said, her voice low-edged with steel. Well, you actually came." Hailey's voice slithered through the line, unchanged after 6 years, melodic, sweet, with a metallic core that could turn a compliment into a blade. 6 years of silence, and you show up to celebrate?" The words were a taunt, laced with the same cruelty Rebecca remembered from childhood, when Hailey would smile at teachers while whispering lies about her sister's failings. Rebecca's grip tightened on the phone, her knuckles whitening. "I was invited," she said, stepping onto the escalator, her voice steady despite the heat rising in her chest. Hailey laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "Because Mom insisted. You know Andrew's excited to see you. You two always had chemistry." The word landed like a slap, deliberate and stinging. Rebecca froze mid-step, the escalator carrying her upward while her heart plummeted. "That's not funny," she said, her voice a low growl. "I wasn't joking," Hailey replied, and Rebecca could hear the smile in her voice, that carefully crafted innocence that hit her sharpest claws. The same smile she'd used at a high school dance, when she'd told the chaperones Rebecca was having a moment, to humiliate her in front of the entire gym. Rebecca ended the call without another word, her pulse a war drum in her ears. The escalator deposited her in the arrivals hall, where the air was thick with the clamor of reunions and farewells. She adjusted her bag and stepped outside, the Virginia air blooming with early spring, cherry blossoms and dogwoods painting the streets of Alexandria like a postcard she'd never send. She rented a car, avoiding the highway, letting the familiar backroads guide her. These were the lanes she'd ridden her bike on as a child, when she was still Becky, when scraped knees and bruised pride were her only wounds. As she drove toward her mother's cul-de-sac, the past pressed closer, heavy as body armor. Mrs. Langford, the neighbor with perpetually trimmed hydrangeas, was watering her garden, the hose coiled at her feet like a question mark. She squinted at Rebecca's car, her head tilting in recognition. "Rebecca," she called, her voice carrying the weight of old gossip. Rebecca stepped out, her bag slung over her shoulder. "Hello, Mrs. Langford." The older woman blinked, taking in Rebecca's posture, the faint outline of ribbons beneath her jacket. "My goodness, you're still in the army." "Yes, ma'am," Rebecca said, her smile tight, showing no teeth. Mrs. Langford nodded slowly, her eyes lingering. "Thought you might have quit after everything." The words hung there, heavy with unspoken judgment. Rebecca's jaw tightened, but her voice remained steady. "Some of us stay," she said, and walked past, her boots clicking on the pavement, each step a defiance. The house loomed ahead, its shutters freshly painted, its porch light flickering like it was holding its breath. Rebecca stood at the edge of the lawn, the invitation burning a hole in her bag. She wasn't here to beg for a place at the table. She was here to remind them of the woman they'd tried to erase, the general they couldn't silence. The wind carried the scent of cherry blossoms, and for a moment, she let it ground her, a fleeting peace before the battle to come. The house stood like a monument to a past Rebecca Cole had long outgrown, its brick facade polished to a sheen that screamed control. The shutters gleamed with fresh paint, the lawn manicured to perfection, and the porch light flickered, as if even the electricity knew to hold its breath in Barbara Cole's domain. Rebecca paused at the threshold, her boots heavy on the pristine steps, the weight of the invitation still burning in her bag. The scent of lemon polish hit her first, sharp and suffocating, her mother's signature. A fragrance that clung to every surface, masking the undercurrent of disapproval that defined this place. She rang the bell, the chime echoing like a warning shot. Footsteps approached, deliberate and measured, and the door swung open. Barbara stood there, a vision of curated perfection in beige slacks and a pearl-printed blouse, her hair pulled into a bun so tight not a strand dared escape. Her eyes, sharp as ever, scanned Rebecca's dress uniform, lingering on the stars and ribbons pinned to her chest. The silence between them thickened, a familiar battlefield where words were weapons and pauses were traps. "Please don't ruin this for Hailey," Barbara said, her voice low, each syllable a needle threaded with warning. Rebecca's jaw tightened, but she said nothing, stepping inside as the door closed behind her with a soft click, like a lock snapping shut. The dining room was a time capsule, unchanged since Rebecca's childhood. The chandelier cast a warm glow over the mahogany table, its surface polished to a mirror-like sheen. Fine china gleamed, each plate a silent accusation of her absence. 15 chairs lined the table, 14 occupied, one waiting for her, a battlefield disguised as a family gathering. Rebecca lingered in the archway, her breath steady but her heart pounding like a war drum. Barbara flitted between guests, refilling wine glasses with the precision of a drill sergeant, her earrings, tiny gold anchors, catching the light, a nod to her late husband's service. Hailey sat at the table's center, her silk blouse pristine, her laughter too loud as she responded to Cousin Grant's unfunny joke. Grant, with his easy charm, drew smiles from the room, but Rebecca saw through it, her eyes catching every detail. The way no one looked her way, the way her presence was a shadow they refused to acknowledge. Her seat was at the far end, tucked beside the buffet, where the kitchen's heat would graze her neck and conversation would never reach. She pulled out the chair, its legs scraping the floor with a sound that cut through the room's hum. Eyes flicked toward her, then away, as if she were a glitch in their carefully scripted evening. Hailey raised her glass, her smile radiant but sharp. "To family," she announced, her gaze skimming past Rebecca, as if she were a stranger who'd wandered in by mistake. Barbara chimed in, her voice smooth as polished stone. "To new beginnings." Her glance darted toward Rebecca, not meeting her eyes but slicing through her. A warning to stay silent, to stay small. Uncle Dean, his face ruddy from wine, lifted his glass. "To Major Foster and his bride-to-be." The room murmured approval, clinking glasses, but no one mentioned Rebecca. No nod to the general who'd flown from Stuttgart, no acknowledgement of the woman who'd saved the groom's life. She sipped her water, the glass cool against her lips, her silence not submission but a weapon they didn't understand. The absence of her name was louder than any toast, a deliberate erasure that stung like salt in a wound. Former Colonel Wilkins, seated beside Barbara, squinted at Rebecca across the table, his brow furrowing. "You look familiar," he muttered, almost to himself. Barbara leaned in quickly, her voice light but edged with control. "Oh, Rebecca. She's been abroad doing security work." The word security landed like a slap, a diminishment disguised as small talk. Hailey's smile widened, venomous. "She guards doors, I'm sure. Very important ones." A ripple of laughter spread through the room, not reaching Rebecca but grazing her like shrapnel. She let her gaze settle on the silverware, a salad fork, a dessert spoon, a knife too dull to draw blood but sharp enough for pretense. Her silence wasn't surrender, it was strategy, a coiled spring waiting to snap. Wilkins tilted his head, his eyes narrowing as memory sparked. "Wait. Afghanistan. 2012, Firebase Kalma." His voice carried the weight of recognition, a flicker of respect that Barbara's subtle shake of her head quickly extinguished. Rebecca met his gaze, her voice steady, cutting through the room's hum. "Yes, sir." Wilkins opened his mouth, as if to say more, then closed it, his eyes dropping to his plate. Barbara's hand twitched, adjusting a napkin, her control reasserting itself. The room moved on, the clink of spoons and polite coughs filling the void, but Rebecca remained a ghost at her own family's table, her presence a disruption they refused to name. She remembered Firebase Calma vividly, the heat, the dust, the scream of incoming fire. She'd led a patrol through a village, her team pinned down, and she'd held the line, her voice steady as she called for air support. It was the mission that earned her a Bronze Star, though her family had never acknowledged it. To them, her uniform was a betrayal, a rejection of their expectations for a daughter who smiled and stayed small. Now, sitting at this table, she felt the weight of that rejection anew, but it no longer crushed her. It fueled her. Hailey's laughter rang out again, sharp and performative, pulling the room's attention back to her. Rebecca's fingers tightened around her glass, the water trembling slightly. She could feel the eyes that avoided her, the whispers that didn't reach her ears but cut all the same. Her mother's voice echoed in her mind. "You're making it about you." It had always been about them, about their image, their control, their story. But tonight, Rebecca wasn't here to play their game. She was here to rewrite the rules. The meal dragged on, plates cleared, wine poured, the room's chatter a dull roar that excluded her. She ate methodically, her movements precise, a soldier's discipline in every bite. When the dessert course arrived, a server hesitated, unsure if she belonged. She nodded, and he placed a slice of cake before her, the gesture a small victory. Across the table, Hailey caught her eye, her smile faltering for a fraction of a second before she turned away, her laughter resuming. Barbara's gaze lingered on Rebecca, not with warmth but with calculation, as if measuring how much damage her daughter's presence might cause. Rebecca set her fork down, the clink loud in her ears. She wasn't here to beg for a place at this table. She was here to remind them of the woman they tried to erase, the general who'd built a life from their silence. The chandelier flickered, casting shadows that danced like ghosts across the walls. Rebecca's heart steadied, her resolve a blade honed by years of betrayal. She would sit through this dinner, but she would not bow. Not tonight. Not ever. The church was a masterpiece of curated perfection, its white lilies framing the altar like sentinels, their petals glowing under the soft light filtering through stained glass windows. The air hummed with the delicate strains of a violin, each note weaving a tapestry of sentiment that felt both sacred and suffocating. General Lieutenant Rebecca Cole stood at the entrance, her dress blues pressed to razor-sharp precision, her hair pinned with military exactness, each strand a silent rebellion against the chaos of her emotions. She was a statue carved from resolve, her stars and ribbons gleaming under the church's golden glow. Yet her presence felt like an intrusion in this carefully orchestrated scene. The invitation had brought her here, but the absence of her name on the seating chart confirmed what she'd always known. She was not part of their story. The foyer was a flurry of activity, guests adjusting corsages, smoothing lapels, their murmurs a polite hum that barely acknowledged her. Rebecca's eyes scanned the seating chart, a floral scripted display on a brass easel, its elegance a cruel mockery. Table after table, name after name, cousins, neighbors, distant relatives, but no Rebecca Cole, no General Lieutenant Cole. Just a void, a silence printed in curling letters. She stood there longer than she intended, her boots rooted to the polished floor, the weight of her exclusion heavier than any metal pin to her chest. A woman in lavender heels brushed past, tapping the board. "Oh, table 8 near the stage," she squealed to her partner. Rebecca's eyes flicked down again. Table 12 in the corner by the fire exit. Of course, Barbara had mentioned it that morning, her voice casual as she handed Rebecca a plate of fruit she hadn't asked for. "You'll be at table 12 out of the way," she'd said, not meeting her daughter's eyes, her words a blade disguised as hospitality. Now, standing in the church, Rebecca felt the sting of that deliberate placement, a calculated exile to the margins of her sister's day. She adjusted her posture, her shoulders square, her chin lifted, refusing to let the slight bend her. She wasn't here to be seen. She was here to be undeniable. The ceremony began with the precision of a military operation. The pews filled, the violin swelled, and a woman in a headset adjusted ribbons on the benches with surgical focus. Rebecca took her place near the back, her uniform a stark contrast to the soft pastels and silks around her. The stained glass cast blue and gold shadows across her face, and for a moment, she felt like an artifact, a relic from a life they'd tried to erase. Hailey entered in white, her dress a cascade of silk that shimmered like a flame, her smile radiant but practiced, a performance for the crowd. Andrew stood beside her, his uniform impeccable, his face unreadable, a soldier's mask honed by years of discipline. His eyes swept the pews, pausing when they met Rebecca's. The moment stretched, heavy with unspoken history. Hellman, the minefield, the blood. But he didn't smile, didn't nod. He turned away, and the ceremony marched on. The priest's voice was a steady cadence, calling for vows, for blessings. When he asked for close family to join the couple at the altar, Rebecca's body moved on instinct, a reflex born of duty rather than desire. She rose, her boots silent on the carpeted aisle, but Barbara's hand was there before she could take a step. It was a gentle touch, just below her elbow, but it carried the weight of a command. "Let's not complicate things," Barbara whispered, her voice soft but unyielding, her fingers smoothing a non-existent crease on Rebecca's jacket. "This is Hailey's day." The words were a dismissal, a reminder that Rebecca's place was not among them, not today, not ever. Rebecca sat, her heart a clenched fist in her chest. The violin played on, sappy and sentimental, as guests dabbed their eyes with embroidered handkerchiefs. Flashes from cameras punctuated the air, capturing Hailey's radiant smile, Andrew's steady presence. The family gathered around them like a tableau of perfection. But Rebecca was not in the frame. She was the shadow in the corner, the uniform that didn't fit their narrative. She remembered Hellman again, the dust, the heat, the way Andrew's pulse had thrummed under her hands as she dragged him to safety. He'd whispered his debt, but here, in this church, no one spoke of the woman who'd saved him. It wasn't part of their fairy tale. The ceremony ended with applause, polite and restrained, as Hailey and Andrew stepped down the aisle, their hands linked, their smiles a matched set. Guests rose, murmuring congratulations, their voices a soft tide that carried them toward the reception hall. Rebecca lingered, her fingers brushing the edge of her sleeve, the scar beneath her uniform a quiet ache. She could have pushed forward, could have forced her way into the blessing, into their story. But that wasn't the point. The point was their refusal to see her, their insistence that she was a stranger in their midst. She straightened, her spine a steel rod, and walked toward the reception, her steps deliberate, each one a defiance. Outside, the Virginia air was thick with spring, the cherry blossoms drifting like soft shrapnel. The reception hall loomed ahead, its chandeliers glittering through the windows, promising another battlefield. Rebecca's hand tightened on her bag, the invitation still inside, its weight a reminder of why she'd come. Not to beg for acceptance, not to plead for a place, but to stand in the truth of who she was. The church's bells tolled behind her, a mournful sound that echoed in her bones. She didn't look back. The war wasn't over. It was just beginning, and she was armed with something sharper than shame, her own unyielding presence. The reception hall was a glittering cage, its chandeliers casting fractured light across tables draped in ivory linen, each centerpiece a cascade of lilies that mirrored the church's curated elegance. The air buzzed with the clink of glasses, the murmur of polite laughter, and the soft strains of a string quartet, all orchestrated to celebrate Hailey's triumph. General Lieutenant Rebecca Cole stood at the edge of the room, her dress blues a stark contrast to the sea of silk and tuxedos, her presence a quiet rebellion against the script of the evening. Table 12, her assigned place, was tucked behind a marble pillar, next to the catering door. A deliberate exile to the margins, where the heat of the kitchen would graze her neck and the conversation would never reach. The place card read, "R. Cole." No rank, no title, just a single letter and a surname that felt like a half-truth. The napkin beside it was slightly faded, a subtle slight that stung like a paper cut. Rebecca sat, her movements precise, her spine a steel rod honed by years of discipline. The room swirled around her, guests orbiting Hailey like planets around a star, their laughter and clinking glasses a chorus of exclusion. She scanned the crowd, her eyes catching the details others missed. The way Barbara adjusted a guest's tie with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. The way Cousin Grant's charm masked his desperation for approval. The way Hailey's silk dress shimmered as she floated from table to table, her laughter a weapon that cut through the room. Andrew stood beside her, his hand resting lightly on her waist, his face a mask of composure. He didn't look at Rebecca, not once, but she felt the weight of his awareness, a silent acknowledgement of the debt that bound them. The waiter approached with a bottle of wine, pouring for the guests at her table, strangers, distant relatives, a former classmate who avoided her gaze. He skipped her glass, muttering, "Oh, non-drinking guest," his eyes flicking to a list before moving on. Rebecca didn't correct him. She sipped her water, the glass cool against her lips, her silence a shield. Across the room, Hailey posed for photographs, her smile radiant, her movements possessive as she kissed cheeks and embraced guests with an intensity that felt like ownership. The flashes of cameras illuminated her like a stage star, each click erasing Rebecca further from the narrative. Barbara rose, her champagne flute gleaming as she raised it for a toast. "To love and loyalty," she said, her voice smooth as polished stone. "The values this family holds above all." The room chuckled politely, glasses clinking, but the words landed on Rebecca like a blow. Loyalty. The irony was a blade, twisting deep. She remembered her father's funeral, the way Barbara had sat between Hailey and Uncle Roy, her lips a thin line, refusing to meet Rebecca's eyes. She remembered Hailey's glance, brief and blank, as if Rebecca were a stranger in a uniform that didn't belong. Loyalty had never extended to her. Hailey took the microphone, her dress catching the light like a flame. "I'm so glad you're all here," she said, her voice melodic, dripping with practiced charm. "Even my big sister made it tonight, all the way from wherever she's stationed, guarding doors for greatness." The room erupted in laughter, sharp and cutting, the kind that slices before it echoes. Rebecca's fingers tightened around her glass, the water trembling slightly. Hailey's eyes met hers, gleaming with delight, a predator savoring the kill. Barbara chimed in, her smile tight. "She's the family disgrace, but at least she's alive." The laughter swelled, a wave crashing over Rebecca, but she didn't flinch. Her silence wasn't surrender. It was a grenade, pin-pulled, waiting to detonate. She stood, not in anger but with the slow, deliberate weight of inevitability. The room didn't notice at first, their laughter still ringing, but Andrew's eyes locked on hers. He wasn't laughing, wasn't smiling, just watching, his gaze steady like a soldier awaiting orders. Hailey's grin faltered, a flicker of uncertainty crossing her face. "Come on," she said, her voice brittle, the microphone amplifying her unease. "It's a joke, Rebecca. Relax. You always take things so seriously." The words were meant to dismiss, to diminish, but they hung in the air, fragile and exposed. Andrew moved. His steps were deliberate, unhurried, cutting through the room like a blade through silk. Past tables of former commanders, academy friends, and relatives in stiff suits, he walked, each step echoing in the sudden hush. The quartet faltered, a violin string squeaking into silence. Guests turned, their forks frozen midair, their whispers dying. He stopped a single pace from Rebecca, his uniform as crisp as hers, his posture rigid with purpose. Then he saluted, sharp, formal, a gesture that carried the weight of a battlefield. "General Major Rebecca Cole," he said, his voice clear, cutting through the room like a gunshot. "My commander." The room gasped, a collective inhale that sucked the air from the space. Hailey's microphone slipped from her fingers, hitting the floor with a dull thud, the sound reverberating like a bomb's aftershock. Her face paled, her eyes wide, her mouth open but silent, as if the reality had outrun her ability to spin it. Barbara's champagne flute tipped, liquid spilling across the table, her hand frozen in midair. The silence was a minefield, every guest a witness to its detonation. And Rebecca stood at its center, unyielding, her stars gleaming like beacons in the dark. She didn't move, didn't speak, her gaze locked on Andrew's. His salute held unwavering, a declaration not of loyalty but of truth. The room was a frozen tableau, glasses half raised, smiles fading, the weight of her presence finally acknowledged. Hailey stumbled back, collapsing onto a chair, her dress pooling around her like a fallen flag. Barbara stood, her voice a breathless rasp. "Rebecca," she began, but the word dissolved, swallowed by the silence she'd helped create. Rebecca's heart pounded, not with fear but with a fierce, burning clarity. They had laughed, mocked, erased her, but Andrew's salute had rewritten the script. She was no longer the sister, the disgrace, the ghost. She was General Major Rebecca Cole, commander, survivor, undeniable. The chandelier flickered, casting shadows that danced like specters across the walls. The quartet resumed, hesitant, but the room remained still, caught in the gravity of her truth. She hadn't come to beg for their approval. She'd come to claim her place, and now, for the first time, they saw her, not as a shadow, but as a storm. The hotel lobby was a sanctuary of shadows, its velvet drapes swallowing the light, leaving only a single lamp to cast a warm, amber glow over the small table where General Major Rebecca Cole sat. The coffee between her and her mother, Barbara, sat untouched, its steam curling into the air like a ghost of words unsaid. The silence was thick, heavy with years of unspoken accusations, a battlefield where neither side had yet drawn blood. Rebecca's dress blues were still crisp, her stars gleaming faintly, but her posture was rigid, her hands folded on the table, fingers steady despite the storm raging within. Barbara sat opposite, her beige blouse impeccable, her pearls absent for the first time Rebecca could remember. Her mother's eyes, usually sharp with control, were softer now, frayed at the edges, as if the weight of the evening had finally cracked her polished facade. "Ella," Barbara said, her voice barely above a whisper, using Rebecca's middle name for the first time in a decade. The word landed like a pebble in a still pond, rippling through the silence. "Can we talk?" Rebecca's gaze didn't waver, her silence a blade honed by years of betrayal. She waited, letting the moment stretch, forcing Barbara to confront the void she'd helped create. The lobby was empty save for a lone concierge in the distance, his footsteps muffled by the plush carpet. The world outside reduced to a faint hum of city lights through the windows. Barbara shifted, her fingers adjusting her blouse with a nervous twitch, a gesture that betrayed the composure she'd spent a lifetime perfecting. "You made a statement tonight," she said, her smile practiced but faltering, the kind she'd used at church luncheons and press photos. "The press is buzzing. Not all of it's flattering." Her voice held a plea, a quiet desperation to control the narrative, but Rebecca remained still, her silence louder than any response. Barbara's nails tapped against the porcelain cup, a staccato rhythm that echoed her unease. "We weren't ready for this, Rebecca. Nobody was. Even you." Rebecca's eyes narrowed, her voice low and deliberate, cutting through the air like a sniper's shot. "Your daughter fainted." The words were cold, precise, a challenge that hung between them. Barbara's gaze dropped to the table, her fingers tightening around the cup. "That's not Hailey's sensitivity," she said, her voice fraying, as if the truth were a thread she couldn't pull without unraveling everything. "Is it reality?" Rebecca asked, her tone steady, each word a weight dropped into the silence. Barbara exhaled sharply, a sound that carried the weight of years of avoidance. "I'm not here to fight," she said, her eyes lifting to meet Rebecca's, searching for a crack in her daughter's resolve. "Then why are you here?" Rebecca leaned forward, her voice unyielding, her stars catching the light like a warning. "You want me to issue a press release? To save your image?" The question was a blade, slicing through Barbara's carefully constructed poise. Her mother flinched, a subtle movement, but Rebecca caught it, the first crack in the armor. "We value privacy," Barbara said, her words rushed, as if she could outrun the truth. "People are asking about Hailey's comments, about you, about us." Rebecca's lips pressed into a thin line, her heart a war drum in her chest. "You didn't protect the family," she said, her voice low but firm, each word a stone laid in a wall of truth. "You erased a daughter." The accusation hung in the air, heavy as smoke, and Barbara's fingers trembled, the cup clinking softly against its saucer. For a moment, her mother's composure shattered, her eyes blinking too quickly, her breath uneven. "I made choices," Barbara said finally, her voice barely audible, a confession wrenched from a place she'd kept locked. "Imperfect ones. But I never stopped caring." "You stopped calling," Rebecca countered, her words sharp, cutting through the haze of her mother's excuses. "You wanted a daughter who smiled and stayed small." The truth was a grenade, its pin pulled, and the silence that followed was deafening. Barbara reached out, her fingers hovering over the table, a tentative gesture toward a daughter she'd pushed away. Rebecca let them hang there, unanswered, her gaze unwavering. She remembered the silence after her father's funeral, the way Barbara had turned her back, the way Hailey had glanced at her with nothing but indifference. She remembered the years of deployments, the near loss of her hearing, the shrapnel scar that still ached in the cold. They hadn't cared then. Why now? The next morning, in a cafe bathed in disorienting morning light, Rebecca sat across from Hailey, the air thick with the scent of overpriced coffee and unspoken accusations. Hailey was late, her sunglasses hiding her eyes despite the dim indoor lighting, her hair pulled into a low bun that screamed control even as her hands betrayed her. A nervous twitch, a fidgeting with the edge of her sleeve. She slid into the booth, her smile a brittle mask, the kind that could crack under the weight of a single truth. "Well," she said, exhaling with forced lightness, "that was dramatic last night." Rebecca said nothing, her silence a challenge, her hands folded on the table, steady as stone. Hailey cleared her throat, her voice a mix of bravado and unease. "Look, I went too far. The gatekeeper thing? Just a joke. Honestly, I didn't think it was a big deal." Rebecca's gaze didn't waver, her silence a weight that pressed against Hailey's words. She reached into her leather folio and slid a single sheet of paper across the table, thick, slightly creased, bearing the official watermark of the Army's Public Affairs Office. Dated 7 years ago, it was a whistleblower report accusing Rebecca of falsifying mission details in Helmand, claiming her Bronze Star was political. A second page followed, a linguistic analysis with a 96% match to Hailey's writing style, the kind of evidence that could bury a career. "You sent this," Rebecca said, her voice calm but unyielding, each word a bullet finding its mark. 2 months before I was passed over for Brigadier General." Hailey's smile froze, her sunglasses slipping slightly, revealing eyes wide with panic. "That's absurd," she said, her laugh forced brittle. "It was anonymous. Could have been anyone." Rebecca placed the second page on the table, her movements deliberate, her eyes locked on her sister's. "You always wrote like that, even in school essays. Nobody with clearance talks that way. But you do." Hailey shifted, her hands twisting in her lap, her voice rising with a defensive edge. "I was angry," she said finally, the words spilling out like a confession she couldn't hold back. "You were always the star, Dad's pride. Everyone compared us. I just wanted room to breathe." Rebecca leaned forward, her voice low, a blade sliding between ribs. "You tried to bury me to shine brighter. But you forgot I burned too." The words hung in the air, a spark in a room full of kindling, and for the first time, Hailey had no response, her sunglasses a frail shield against the truth. Rebecca stood, leaving the papers on the table, her heart steady, her resolve a fire that no one, not her mother, not her sister, could extinguish. The rooftop bar was a quiet refuge from the chaos below, its polished wooden floor reflecting the city lights that flickered like broken promises across the Virginia skyline. General Major Rebecca Cole stood near the railing, the cool night air brushing against her dress blues, her stars catching the faint glow of a neon sign below. The bar was nearly empty, save for a bartender polishing glasses and a couple murmuring in the corner, their voices lost to the wind. Andrew Foster leaned against the railing a few feet away, a glass of amber liquid cradled in his hand, his posture less like a groom and more like a man carrying a debt too heavy to name. The silence between them was a battlefield, not of anger but of unspoken truths, each moment a step closer to the edge. "I didn't think you'd come," Andrew said, his voice low, roughened by the bourbon or something deeper. He didn't turn to face her, his eyes fixed on the city below, the lights blurring into a mosaic of memories neither could escape. Rebecca stepped closer,